is Veronica. My last name's Montes. My family is from Guadalajara, Jalisco. Both of my parents are from there. They both came to the United States pretty young. My dad was 16. My mom was like about 20, 21. But both were granted residency through the amnesty program that I think it was Reagan. My dad and my mom met in Pilsen at the Nuevo Leon restaurant. My mom was a server. My dad was the cook. And they started dating. Shortly after my parents were married, they moved to Berwyn. My dad worked in construction and actually retired a few years ago. My parents actually bought a restaurant when I was probably like 5 years old in Pilsen, and we moved back after moving out into the suburbs. So when we were living in Berwyn, I was too young to remember, but I know it was predominantly white at the time. And when we moved back to Pilsen, it was still considered a pretty dangerous neighborhood. It was actually like in the intersex of where many gangs met. Both my brother and I and my sister, I'm the youngest of three, we lived pretty sheltered lives. We didn't really have friends in the neighborhood. Most of my classmates for the majority of my life were Mexican. We were very fortunate that my parents had the luxury of being able to travel back and forth from the States to Mexico, and that all three of us had citizenship. So we would spend summers in Guadalajara. The fact that we didn't have friends and we weren't able to go out as much because my mom was trying to keep us safe, we kind of relied a lot on television and programming, diverse shows on television. I didn't have friends that were either white, black, Asian until I was older as an adult. When I went to college, it's the first time that I experienced diversity in actual real experiences. I went to a high school in Pilsen called Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. So it's a corporate internship program that they embed into the curriculum. So every student, instead of going to class once a week, would go into a job in the workforce. And you would go into like either a hospital, a law firm, a company. I got to go to a law firm, and everyone that I worked with was predominantly white. So for the majority of my adult life, I was mentored by white women. And so the corporate world was also like my first experience with diversity. My parents were conservative Catholics. So I went to Catholic school from like kindergarten to like my first year of college. I really loved the campus at Dominican University. I was excited to go there, but I realized like that's when I knew Chicago was a very segregated city. And I witnessed it because it was a small university, and I was living in the dorms, but the majority of my friends, like everybody just kind of like stuck with what they knew. So obviously I joined the Latino organization. So I sat with all the Latinx kids, and then I would look around and I would just see like all the soccer kids, like almost kind of like in a movie.
Mean Girls.
Everybody was in their own table, and I had a problem with it because I think I had expectations that, most of my life, like I celebrated my Mexican culture, and I was very, very proud of that. But I also kind of didn't have the opportunity. Like I remember going back to Mexico and hanging out with my cousins, and they were like fascinated. Like you probably have friends that are white, that are black, that are Asian, and I'm like, actually, no, I don't. Like I don't even know anybody. Like I just, just other than I know from what I would see on television. In my family, like my brother, my sister, and I, like, we were the first to engage with the corporate world. And we had nothing to like, or anyone to kind of relate to at home other than what we had at school. And I feel like that also made a huge difference.
What challenges do you feel you have faced as a Mexican American in terms of identity?
I think as a kid, it was not very evident like that I had any like real challenge, just because everywhere I looked, it, looked like me, and it was a celebration of like who we were as as a people and as a community. Like if you go to Pilsen, like that's what it always will feel like. And I think I tend to have this love affair with that community because it reminds me of being a kid. Also that connection to my family.
Mhm.
So I think I never had an issue with being Mexican. I think I've always been very proud of that. And I almost even took it for granted just how lucky I was to grow up in Pilsen with not like without having issues with like in immigration status. Like as an adult, I look back and I'm like, holy shit, like a lot of my peers or like a lot of the members of like my community lived a very different reality than I did. You know, I feel like I was very privileged just having citizenship. I think there's like a misconception of like, oh, like immigration, that people come here just to make money, but in reality, people come here to for opportunity, like really, and for survival. Like they don't want to leave. Like my parents talk about leaving their family as such a devastating event in their lives, like not coming to a country that doesn't really either want them or makes them feel like less than, and you don't even know the language and you're leaving your family. Like those are all elements of like not something that someone really wants to truly do. I think they do it because they have to. And because my parents owned a restaurant, they helped a lot of people who didn't have any paperwork. Like they didn't have citizenship. So they would hire them. They didn't have family. So we would spend holidays with most of the employees. Like my parents would always invite them. My mom wouldn't even go and like get them like a small gift, you know, because she knew what that was like to come here without her family. The parts I struggled with as a child had nothing to do with being Mexican, but being a woman in a Mexican culture.
Mm-hmm.
I've experienced like certain differential like treatment, especially when you're in a conservative home. There are different expectations from men and women. And my brother and I grew up very close in age. We were like a year apart. And when we were little, like, you know, you don't take on those assumptions of like gender roles. And he really just wanted someone to play with. So I was very gender fluid with like some of the like games that we'd play. Like I'd play Hot Wheels, and because he was the oldest, so he would decide what we would play. So I always kind of felt like that equal, like we were the same, like we deserved the same things. And it wasn't until like as we were getting older, you know, he was like, when he did something, it was like, oh my God, you know, like he's talking to girls now. And like, if I was talking to boys, like it was just so frowned upon. Like I hated this thing, this term that they would say, te vas a quemar, you know, like, no te quemes. Like, and it literally means like, you're going to blow up in flames, bitch, if you like become a hoe. And so like, I resented that because I felt like, I was like, like, why?
Yeah.
You know? And so there was just this notion of like, if you embraced even just, I mean, when it comes down to it, your sexuality, like you're wrong for that.
Right.
And so I always had a huge problem with that. Like, I think it's one of the reasons why I have such feminist, like, and womanist ideologies, where I always challenged it. Like, I always was like, well, why? You know, like, and I grew to be very opinionated because of it. I think there's like two incidents in particular that I remember that like I was reflecting on recently. And one was like when my brother used to have so many like he was such a womanizer, you know, even as a little kid. And I would hear about him like, oh, he like kicked it to her, whatever. Like that was like the term, you know, when you kissed a girl or whatever. And I was like younger and timid, and that just wouldn't happen to me as often, like as he would have those experiences. So when it did happen to me, and, you know, we were close in age, like I shared that with him. And I was like, oh, you know, like I finally had someone, they kissed me. And he was so mad at me. He like slapped me across the face.
Oh.
Yeah. And I told this story to my mom today, and my mom was just like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, Mom, I don't know. My dad's never hit my mom, you know, and we've never seen that. And like, and I don't like, I don't want to hold this against my brother, you know, because I do love my brother. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I just think that that form of toxic masculinity was learned from somebody in our culture because it's dominant, like the machismo, like that.
Yes.
That is such a prevalent issue that we need to, like, I had to explain. I felt like, Mom, like, I need to get this off my chest because these are things that we never talk about. We don't talk about a lot of things, but I want to tell you how that affected me and what it did to me as a result of that. Because then when I was older, I was in Mexico and I had my first boyfriend. I think I was like 12, 13, and I was kissing a boy. My uncle, mind you, not my dad, my uncle, my dad's brother, saw me and then pulled me by my hair. And I swear to you, till this day, like, if anybody like plays with my hair, like, I'm just like, don't touch my hair. Please don't touch my hair. But I was telling her that I'm like, those to me are acts of violence to women.
Yeah.
As much as like you want to say that you're disciplining me like that, first of all, like, my brother has no right to discipline me. Neither does my uncle. Right. And never with like any physical touch to me. Mm-hmm. But somehow they in their mind think that that's okay and that's a problem. But like later on, like, I told my mom, I was like, you have to realize that like when we allow men to do that to us, we almost give them the right to like have that physical power over us. And like, what do you think that says to, like, we're saying to them that it's like, even though you hit me, even though you hurt me, like, you still love me, so that's okay. And you know, it just kind of creates this pattern where you like you equivalate like love and home with those things being tolerated and accepted. Mm-hmm. Most of like my adult life, I felt like that was a part of me that I was like, I don't want to be that Mexican woman. Like, I'm a whole, like, I was the first in my family to go away to college. The majority of my cousins married very early, like 20, Dang. 21. Yeah. Not even like, they couldn't even drink at their wedding legally. And it baffled me, but I think it was just a cultural thing where it was like accepted, like, you want to get out of your house, you got to get married. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't want to do that. And I would remember like, even like, I remember when my sister was dating, like, it was very, and when I say conservative, like Catholic, like Mexican families, like, if you go to Mexico and you're dating, like, your boyfriend comes to visit you, like, outside your door. You don't go on dates. You know, like, I was my sister's third wheel for the majority of her relationship for a long time. But that was just the way that they used to do things. And I remember like, as like I was pretty young, and I would sit down with my dad and I'd be like, listen, I feel the need to tell you, but I refuse. I'm not going to do that. Mm-hmm. I rather do it the Americanized way. And he was just like, what the fuck? Like, you don't get to decide.
You're like, yes.
But I'm like, no. Say no more. I've already decided this is for my best interest. Like, because either I'm going to get married really young and get divorced like mid, you know, there are things that bubbled up for me that were from the corporate world. When we did the corporate internship program in high school, I remember specifically one time we all had it was like workshops. There were workshops before the actual school year began. And one of them, they had to do with dress code and just the way you dressed. And it was two white women that were running the workshop program, and it had to do with makeup and with like work clothes, like what's appropriate in the workforce. And I remember specifically that they were telling us about hoop earrings and dark lip liner. Oh. Yeah, and a lot of us felt like, whoa, she did not go there. We felt offended. But it was a real conversation that they had with us that, you know, it wasn't professional. And I remember like in high school, like realizing like, well, a lot of us were like, well, I can't wear my hoop earrings then, I guess, you know, because you're being told that like the way you are is just not going to cut it, you know, and you're young, you don't even know.
And that's specifically like a style that you see like in the Latinx community. I remember growing up always seeing girls with like the hoops and like the kind of like scrunched like curls and the lip liner. So that's like specifically a look. So it's like it is kind of an inherently racist remark to make.
Yeah, and I mean the crazy part is that the school itself was the program was run by Latinx professionals, and to some extent, like they agreed, you know, that that this was what was acceptable. I remember recently having this conversation with my best friend because we went to high school together, and she's like, you know what? I remember specifically you told me that you were like not going to wear hoop earrings anymore. And I felt offended because I still wanted to wear my hoop earrings. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I told you that. Because like now, like I wear my hoop earrings all the time. I even like wear more than one earrings, but
I usually have like this.
yeah, I do the two and stuff. And I wear the dark lip. Like you hardly ever see women in the corporate world like wearing like a dark red. But I think about that too. And I think that, you know, it's an important conversation to have because I feel this idea of professionalism is structured from like white supremacy ideals. You know, like they decided what, like who had a convention and was like, you can't wear bell bottoms, girl.
Right.
Those aren't like, that's going to affect the way that you work. Your strategic planning is going to get fucked up if you wear bell bottoms and hoop earrings and the dark lip. Like no one's going to take you seriously. And that, like, that's problematic. Like, why not? Like I can do the exact same things wearing red, like a dark red lip and hoop earrings. Like it's not a big deal. Exactly. And I think that culture that, you know, you stepped into, like, if you don't like challenge it a little bit, like it's always going to be the same, you know? Absolutely. So when I had first started in the corporate world, like not outside of like the corporate internship program, like after I had graduated college, I kind of took all those things with me. And I was very, very tense about, you know, what I did. And like, I always felt very insecure about how I did it. And I actually like pulled myself out of the corporate world when I was working on my master's program because I felt like I wanted to jump into a completely different industry. And I was working in the nonprofit realm. And to supplement my income, I also was working in the hospitality industry. And obviously, like both of those industries are a little bit more relaxed. And, you know, especially if you're out working in the community, like, you know, you could do it in jeans or whatever. You could do the same thing in the hospitality industry. You're working the nightlife and it's a little bit more liberating to be yourself.
Have you ever been discriminated against because you are Mexican?
No, not. It has never been where it's like, oh my God, like that was fucked up. You know, I think the one time that I remember, like when we were working at Taco Joy, I don't know if I told you this, it was like late night and it was like a party. It was already past like the lights were up, like we were about to close and they were still hanging out. So we weren't going to kick them out because they were a party. And I remember like they were really, really nice. It was predominantly white people. And like one guy was like, Maria. And someone was like, wait, that's not her name. And like, I was like, he knew exactly what my name was. I kept saying it, you know, hi, I'm Veronica. Cause I would tell it to like a lot of people. He, not only did he say it, but he realized that, wait, that's not her name. And someone said it and he felt horrible about it afterwards. But it was just, I was like, that's like how you feel though. Like, that's how you, I don't know, like that's in the back of your brain. Like, you know, that came out of nowhere.
Right.
But obviously that's like not even like close to what I know my dad went through. Like my sister, I remember she told me this story of when we were living in Berwyn because we were predominantly, like we were the only like Mexican family in a predominantly white neighborhood. Like girls would like not want to play with her and would talk about her thinking that she didn't even speak Spanish. I mean, she didn't speak English, that she only spoke Spanish. And she would tell me about that. So I never experienced like stuff like that. And I think that the reason being is that was just my experience, like growing up in Pilsen and everybody was Mexican. So who was going to discriminate me? But the other part is that I realized later on, like or at least in my family, my mom is dark skinned. My dad and most of his family is like really, really light skinned. My brother and my mom are a little bit darker than me and my sister.
Okay.
And I never realized like the issue of colorism within our own culture, mainly because like my mom would call my brother negro, you know, and it was in a way of like, in a very loving way, you know?
Okay.
And I mean, we knew the difference, but my brother had like a lot of, like, he was a very attractive guy growing up. So guys were all, like, I mean, women were always like swooning after him. And I always thought that like, I never had an issue like with, I always thought like if I wanted to be tan, like if I wanted to be darker, like I thought I'd look good.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I used to tan for a little bit, and my dad was the one that once told me like, but you're like light skin, like estás bien bonita, blanquita. And I'm like, well, I like, it's okay if I'm darker, like it's pretty too, like. And I didn't realize like he had like, he wanted me to be light skinned. I wonder too, like the fact that I'm a woman or that I'm a light skinned Mexican woman, if that filters why I never really experienced harsh racism. I know for a fact that that's very minimal in comparison to some of the stories that even when I was doing community organizing, I'm more conscious of the fact that like how my citizenship status and the color of my skin plays a role, because I heard people talk about like, well, I didn't have my papers, and or I was a dark skinned person, and like I was treated differently. So it's mostly because of those experiences that I learned about other people's experiences that I know that where I stand is a form of privilege.
I definitely like struggled with this throughout my life, like feeling like I was never like white enough and I was never Mexican enough for like, just even with like friend groups or even like with my family, because like one side of my family is Polish and my mom is Polish and Greek, and then my whole dad's side of the family, like my dad was born in Mexico and like moved to Chicago when he was like, I think like 2 years old or something like that. I was so like, my one side of my family, you know, was like, you know, we ate like Mexican food. We like, you know, would go to Mexico all the time, like going to my grandma's house, everybody's like speaking Spanish. So it's like being with my dad was like really fully immersed in that culture. And then on my mom's side of the family, it was just like, you know, quite American. So I kind of always felt like I was like in between these worlds, and I was like, oh, I don't really know which one I even like identify with. So I felt like I was never enough for either, even in my family. And then obviously like coming out into the world, you know, in American society, being like so heavily, you know, white, and like, you know, even like you said, like in a corporate world, even in school, you have to kind of adhere to this kind of like whiteness code, you know, of like how you dress, how you look, how you even speak, how you act. And so yeah, I always felt like I was like, I feel like I'm like too Mexican to act like that. Like, I don't want to dress like that. I don't want to, yeah. So I never felt like enough. Did you ever have that experience?
I did, yeah. I mean, especially when you're like, you're in Pilsen, even though you're surrounded by a Mexican community, but you are predominantly like either reading books in English or watching American television programming, your Spanish isn't the greatest. You know, it's not like you're taking Spanish courses. So when we would spend summers, and that would help being in Guadalajara. But I remember I would often be corrected. And we would say things like we would speak Spanglish and not even realize that like our own parents, like we don't say like, I forgot what's the word for closet, but we wouldn't say, like we would say closet, you know? I remember like when I was out there, I felt a little insecure about like expressing myself, and because I even to this day, like I struggle expressing myself in Spanish fully. I mean, I could understand it. I could speak it well, like, you know, I can carry a conversation, but it's different when you like, you know, you want especially because I'm a writer, like I like to write and be very, I like metaphors and elaborate words to speak eloquently when I'm writing. Like it doesn't translate as easily. Like sometimes I think in English when I have like a lot of deep thoughts, so I can't regurgitate it in Spanish because I'm trying to like translate it in my brain. I mean, it's kind of sad to say, but like because I watch so much television, like I watched a lot of Disney, Nickelodeon, and it was just a part of who I was too. Like I was an Americanized person, but like then I did live this world, and I never felt like no one ever made me feel like, oh, well, you're really, really Mexican or you're not American enough. No one ever really made me feel that way.
Like it was so weird because like the situations I had where like people did make me feel like I was too white
Hmm.
was also in my family. Like I remember people would say, oh, you're too skinny, like you don't even look Mexican because you don't have like meat on your bones. 'Cause I was like really skinny as a kid. So like for a while I was like I felt so bad about myself. So I was like, I guess I'm like too skinny, but then I felt like I always had more curves, a little bit more curves than like an average white girl. So I kind of like, even just with my body, felt like I was like, I don't know if I want to say discriminated against, but just kind of like outcasted from
Yeah.
because of it.
Yeah, now that you actually bring that up, I do remember that too. I struggle too with being like super skinny. And I think in high school, I went through a period where I was like really stressed out my parents sold the restaurant. I was in high school.
Mhm.
So we were in a very in between situation because my dad wanted to move to Mexico when we were selling the restaurant. And I was really stressed out. And on top of that, like I was already a petite person and skinny. So I remember getting that a lot of like, especially because a lot of women, are usually like very curvy in our culture. Like I was always told that I was like too skinny, and I was just like, well, I don't know. Like
Like,
I'm
what do you
a
want me to
small
do?
woman.
I'm like, I'm eating so many beans.
Yeah, I eat, but there was times where I know that my stress was affecting my weight, and I really didn't know how to identify that. I remember my cousins would say, I was the youngest, and they're like, why do you talk like a white girl?
Yeah.
Like, why do you like talk like a white girl and shake your head? And I'm like, well, I don't know.
You're like,
You mean speak, enunciate? You mean like enunciate words? I
Mhm.
mean, I read a lot. I watched a lot of PBS. So I kind of felt like I did feel like because I didn't have and I'm pretty sure my Latina accent would come in and out. And what as I got older, I'm sure it went away.
Yeah.
But I think that bothered people that I didn't sound like some type of way.
My father, he didn't teach me and my sister Spanish because he didn't want us to have an accent when we spoke English, which I
Mm.
thought was really interesting because he doesn't have an accent when he speaks English.
Yeah.
He doesn't have an accent when he speaks either or. So I'm like, why that is such an interesting fear to have, but as well, that really shows like again, like this, succumbing to whiteness. It's like, oh, okay, well,
Yeah.
I figure what he was thinking is like, okay, I want my children to, have to face like the least obstacles as possible. So for him, it was like, let's not teach them Spanish so that maybe people will take them more seriously.
Mm.
We sound, more American. But it's funny because like now I feel ashamed when I speak Spanish because I know people can like hear that it's not like when I lived in Spain, I would be like hola, la, la, like, and say whatever I needed, and they just immediately start speaking to me in English because, like, okay, we can tell,
Yeah.
it's not your first language. It's like, don't, and I tell people, I'm like, no, 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 please speak Spanish to me. I want to learn.
I think that's a very important like thing that in America we shame accents, but we don't realize that in other parts of the world, people speak more than one language. They speak and you can tell that they when they speak English they have an accent, but to me it when I hear that like they're speaking all these different languages, like I feel very like, oh, I don't know. I just know Spanish, but I know Spanish by default. Like, it really is a skill to be able to like learn a whole different language, and it should be commendable, that we should definitely shift the way that we perceive how we sound. Because I look at like for example, like my boyfriend, when he learned Spanish because he wanted to be able to communicate with my parents, and he really pushed himself to learn. And I'm like amazed by the way that him and my parents like will sit down at dinner and like will really enjoy trying to have a conversation with each other, and it's the cutest thing. But like it just tells me like, bitch, you could learn French, like you could learn Italian, because look at, he did it. Like and at first he felt like a little embarrassed, but he got over it.
That's so good.
And we should really encourage that.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Was it difficult for you to continue to cultivate your identity as a Mexican person living in America with the lack of representation in media?
It was not difficult for me. In fact, like I thought like, okay, because I grew up in Pilsen and because I had that experience where everybody was Mexican and everybody was telling you to be proud and you're a proud Latina, you're a proud Latina. For me, it was like, yes, I'm a proud Latina, but I'm so much more, like, but I need to figure that out first. Like, it's a huge part of me, but it's not everything. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, it was not hard for me to embrace that part of me, but I think it was harder for me to discover the other parts of me and kind of negotiating that with that one part of me. Because, for example, even just, this part of me that is a very spiritual person, I had to kind of like let go of all of that programming that I had from being growing up in a conservative Catholic home. And what that was like with my parents and how they embraced me regardless of what I chose to experience and believe. Above all things, I'm first and foremost a being, a spiritual being having human experience. And I chose to have a Mexican background with this particular family with a reason. Mm-hmm. And I think that is very different when I just say, oh, I'm a Latina or I'm a Mexican woman. Like I usually say, I'm a Mexican woman, a being of infinite divine light, a spiritual warrior. There's just so many other things, but it's a huge part of me, but it's not everything.
I really love that you said that. For me, it was because I've always kind of felt so caught in between and not really knowing like which, or if it was possible to really fully identify with like either part of me. And I think like because I had like my life experience with my family and my neighborhood and stuff like that, and then I had my experience with like media and never seeing myself represented. So I think like you hit it on the head that like it really was like such a gift for you to grow up in Pilsen and have like that empowerment behind that, because I pretty much had like just my family, living in a predominantly like, yes, there were some Mexican people in my neighborhood for sure, but it was like definitely a mixture. It's not like Pilsen. I feel like Pilsen, there's such a strong like Mexican heritage there. So I kind of had the media kind of only really showing me like white images and kind of not really knowing like, oh, nobody like really looks like me. I kind of felt like I was like, oh, why don't I look this way? Why isn't my family like this? Or why I didn't feel represented at all. So then I kind of found that like throughout my life, I was like, I don't know how useful it is for me to really identify with a culture, identify with like a demographic, because I didn't feel like it even fully represented me. Like I was like, I'm so much more than that. Like all my experiences and just who I'm as a person and how I actually want to represent myself and like spiritually and with art and stuff. I was like, it's not like just to say like I'm a Mexican woman, it doesn't fully define everything. Yeah. And that's kind of how I found like my identity as a person. Is what about Mexican culture is most important to you and your expression?
Definitely my family. I think my family, like if it weren't for my family, I wouldn't be so in love with my culture, because I feel like that it when I see things about Mexico and like the parts that I love about it immediately draws me to my mom and my dad. Because like for example, like the Day of the Dead, we've never celebrated it together as a family because it's usually celebrated when we were in school. So we were never in Mexico when that happened. And my parents when my dad retired, they moved out to Guadalajara. And so they've gone to the celebrations. And recently, last year was like the first year that I ever did an altar. So even though like those weren't things that we did together, like they have more meaning because they're tied to the entirety of Mexico and like what they do, and somehow some way like we've kind of embedded them in our practices as a family. I had my grandfather on the altar, and my grandfather from my dad's side of the family, he was a very patriarchal figure. Like he just had a really strong presence, such a strong presence that in my like the development of my spiritual abilities, when I was like really sensing things, I would sense him a lot. Like I would dream him vividly, and he would tell me things that I had no way of like, I just feel like he's telling me X, Y, and Z. And we weren't really close. We weren't close in like when he was alive. I was really, really young. But he died really early, like he was like 67, really like young. I added him onto the altar, and just even though like my nieces and my nephews were like still not really understanding what was happening, it was really beautiful to see like my cousins, especially my older cousins who had more deep, vivid memories of him, talk about him. And we hadn't talked about him in what felt like years. And just sharing that with them not only made me feel closer to them, but like made me feel closer to him. Like I felt like I was getting to know him and keeping his memory alive, because he wasn't a perfect man, but I know for a fact like he was a very strong like presence. Like there wasn't like a priest nearby. He was kind of like the closest thing to a priest that they could find. So they would summon him when like someone was dying or something like that. And I always knew that he like studied the Bible like religiously. Like he would have like Bible groups where they would just discuss it. And he would ring a bell. Like when it was like a call to prayer, when we would have to pray the rosary. I thought that was really, really powerful, that he was such a being that was very spiritually evolved, and I had no idea. But now that it makes sense, that I feel really, really connected to him sometimes. I feel him giving messages.
There's like parallels because so I'm named after my great grandmother.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, and so my family is from Torreon. So she actually was a nun.
What state is that from, Turion?
It's like the north. I think it's Nuevo Leon. Is like
Oh, Nuevo Leon. Oh, okay, yeah.
And so she was a nun, and everybody said that she had like really special, like a really special energy. Like she would bless like people that would like come into contact with her. Like my mom says, she's like, you would just be around her and you would just feel like there was just something so special about her. She would bless anybody that would come like into contact with her. And my mom was like, you really felt like blessed like when she would bless you. And she was a nurse for the neighborhood, so she took care of like all the kids and like gave like shots to kids who needed it. And like if something was wrong, she would like go to their house and help them if they were sick. So she was like a really special woman. But I would say like for me too, like the most important part of Mexican culture is like the spirituality of it, especially because I don't feel like American culture has any like core spirituality. It's very much based in like capitalism, greed,
or like Puritan values, but those are a little warped.
yeah, and it's like Puritan values just based on like shaming people and not
yeah, that's what I meant.
you should treat people well, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I feel like with Mexican culture, it does connect me to magic. Like I really feel like Mexican culture has like this really beautiful like magical element to it. Like there really is truly a beautiful spirituality in the culture.